Chairman Greg Dyke expressed serious concerns about security in nearby Lille, where England fans will gather before their next match. Russia plays Slovakia in the northern city on Wednesday.
And we'll have more news later. Time now for the France 24 debate. ISIS may be losing ground in Iraq, Syria and Libya, but is it winning the public relations war? After claiming responsibility for the Orlando gay nightclub massacre, Islamic State militants endorsing the stabbing death of a Paris area cop and his companion under the eyes of their 3-year-old son. The suspect, a 25-year-old French national who'd recently come out of jail for running a jihadist network to Pakistan and Afghanistan. Could the attack have been prevented? Was it coordinated or an impulse decision made on the heels of the worst ever mass shooting by a lone gunman in U.S. history in Orlando? As with Orlando, a hostage situation gave the attacker time to air his message. In Florida, it was a call to emergency services, pledging allegiance to ISIS. In Magnanville, west of Paris, a live video broadcast on Facebook that was subsequently taken down, as well as tweets from the siege. The French president, within hours, calling it a terrorist attack, vowing a firm response. Already the opposition's gone one better on socialist François Hollande, with Marine Le Pen's far-right National Front calling for a blanket ban on radical Islam. And while there's little word on how she plans to do that, the rhetoric resembles what we've heard from Republican candidate Donald Trump these past 48 hours. Does each attack claimed by ISIS mean more votes for Le Pen, Trump, and for a Brexit? Is there a response that preserves the values of Western liberal democracy? Today in the France 24 debate, are these attacks preventable? With us, political scientist Assiam El-Difraoui, who joins us, who will be joining us shortly from Washington. A former advisor to the U.S. Defense Department security consultant Ubay Shah Bandar. Many thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
From Antwerp, Belgium, Ricardo Beretsky, president of the European Center for Information Policy and Security. Welcome back to the show. And in a moment, we'll get the opinions of criminologist Alain Bauer, who advised the 9/11 task force. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter are hashtag F24debate. Let's talk about the attacker, 25 years old, a French citizen of Moroccan descent. He grew up in the projects west of the French capital, less than 20 kilometers from the quiet suburb where he killed that police couple. The Paris prosecutor says La Rossi Abala pledged allegiance to the Islamic State group 3 weeks ago. Investigators say they also found a hit list of VIPs, police, and rappers. More from Laurent Berstecker.
Helicopters patrolling the night sky in an area on lockdown. At 9 p.m. on Monday, an individual armed with a knife attacked and killed a policeman before taking refuge inside his home. As midnight struck, gunshots echoed through the streets of the usually peaceful suburb. The assault had just been launched.
Negotiations did not succeed, so the decision was made to storm the house. This explains the shots that we just heard.
The body of the victim's wife was found inside the house. She too was working in the force.
We are overcome with grief. He was a commanding officer at the Mureaux station, and she was secretary to the Mantes-la-Jolie commissioner.
Special forces managed to rescue the couple's 3-year-old son, and the attacker was shot and killed in the assault. He claimed to be acting on behalf of the Islamic State group. Investigators are now trying to determine his exact ties to the terrorist organization.
All right, let's talk to criminologist Alain Bauer. As you heard in that report, police in shock after the death of that couple. Was this something that was preventable, since this is a man who had done jail time for running a jihadist network?
Well, the problem is in 9 on 10 attacks, terrorist attacks in the West, you discover afterwards that the guy was not only known, but sometimes famous. It happens with almost everybody since 1995 and Khaled Kelkal. So the big issue is that we are collecting a lot of data, but analyzing them and hierarchizing them and understanding them is clearly still an issue. At a moment where we put almost everybody in the no-fly list or the dangerous list, because we want to be sure we will not be able to be taken into a situation that he will not be in the list. But unfortunately, when you put everybody on a list, nobody is more important than anybody else. And then you lose control of the size of the list and of the dangerosity you may have of the people in the list.
So what you're saying, Alain, is that the Western intelligence agencies don't have the manpower or the know-how to analyze all that data they have.
Unfortunately, they don't do counterterrorism. They do counter-spying. That's their culture. Counterterrorism doesn't really exist in the West. What people are doing at the moment is transferring what they did against the red spy that was extremely comfortable and extremely well-known to something they don't really understand that is first totally plural. We have now usual state terrorism that almost disappeared, nationalist terrorism like IRA, ETA that is almost out, hybrids like Kelkal, which mean criminals that are on the way of violence and terrorism, but not militant or politically motivated or initially politically motivated, lumpen terrorists, proximity terrorists, which are totally Uberized and that are just connected to the network, but that are totally independent. When they decide to act, they just follow instruction on just do it. So when you look at all this diversity, it's very difficult to be still on the good old comfortable terrorism from before the end of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So the issue is about quality. It's about a cultural change in the system. And that means more analysts and less Inspector Google.
And less Inspector Google. One final question for you, Alain Bauer. I've heard you say in the past that there's really very, very rarely such a thing as a lone wolf, that even when we describe it as such, very often it turns out not to be the case. It certainly doesn't seem to be the case of a lone wolf in what's transpired here in France, what with 3 people now in custody. This man had been part of a network. But how about over in Orlando, Florida? Could that be a lone wolf?
A lone wolf, as the Americans described it 25 years ago about white supremacists, is somebody with his own ideology, his own means, and totally independent in decision. Everybody that has a connection or said, I am allegiant to whatever, it's not a lone wolf. It's like a special envoy. It's not a lone journalist. It's just far from headquarters. And the big issue is to understand what is really a lone wolf. So we use it because isolated terrorists are there, and because networks are now much more smaller than usual. But the big issue is more about understanding how the system is working and how decentralized it is now. Lone wolf is a good excuse to explain why the intelligence failed. It's not a sociological or archetypal explanation. It's just an excuse.
Criminologist Alain Bauer, many thanks for joining us here in the France 24 debate. I wanted to open it up now to some of the others in our panel. Let me begin with you, Ricardo Boretsky. Do you agree with Alain Bauer when he says that Western agencies have not really understood yet counterterrorism? All they do is counter-spying and counterterrorism by Google, as he put it?
Yes, to a very large extent, I must say, is absolutely spot on. Most important is why counterterrorism is so low on the list, particularly the training. We must not forget, and not many people are aware of this, that counterterrorism training was brought in by the UN for a small number of years only, and sadly 2 years ago it disappeared off the radar of training. And counterterrorism is one of the big lacks of training, because the officers is correct to say they are very well trained in espionage, counter-espionage, and also countermeasures in intelligence. But counterterrorism is another type of thing altogether. And what is really important is that these programs has to be brought back across not only the European Union, but also across all the Western allies, because that's really the big problem, is not understanding the data because of the understanding and the training behind to interpret the data. And this is a real concern that I think a lot of the governments is facing at the moment, but they still haven't woken up, even though we've seen these big attacks in the last few months. They haven't got to grips to understand that they have to change their methodology.
Ubay Shahbandar, do you agree? And how do you change that methodology?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me just say that it is shocking, absolutely shocking, that we're continuing to see the same type of intelligence failure and law enforcement failures that are allowing radical Islamist terrorists to fall through the net. I mean, as your previous guest said, these terrorists aren't coming out of the cold. They're not coming out of nowhere. More often than not, they are well known to counterterrorism intelligence officials or federal law enforcement officials. I mean, and they're almost immediately identified as having either once been under investigation or currently under investigation. That was the case in the horrible terror attacks in Orlando that we just saw, and it was also the case in Paris, in the Bataclan attacks, and in Brussels. Yet time and time again, there is an abject failure by counterterrorism intelligence officials to share information with local law enforcement officials and analysts, and to preemptively act upon this information before these horrible attacks happen. Yet we've seen this happen in Orlando and Paris and Brussels. San Bernardino attacks could have also been prevented. These so-called lone wolf attacks are always supported by a network, and more often than not, these terrorists, these radical Islamist terrorists, are either well-known or have been investigated previously. Something has to change in the Western counterterrorism and intelligence analytical structure to prevent this from happening. In the United States, there has been some progress since 9/11 on this front. The CIA and the FBI established an intelligence fusion center called the Counterterrorism Center here in the Washington area. Yet again, we are seeing these local, homegrown, usually citizens, either citizens of the United States or citizens of France, conducting these attacks, inspired by ISIS or other radical Islamist ideologies, and they have the material and they have the weapons locally to conduct these attacks, and they are absolutely, in my opinion, preventable if the analysts and the intelligence officials and the law enforcement officials had taken greater oversight and greater care.
Ubay, let me ask you about the Orlando attacker, because we're getting confusing information here. On the one hand, somebody who may have been radicalized, who certainly was, according to law enforcement officials, somebody who had been tempted by radical discourse. Yet we're also hearing from his ex-wife that he has mental health issues. We're hearing now patrons of that gay nightclub saying that he'd been a regular customer there. So we're getting all sorts of confusing word as to what the actual motive may have been.
Well, all these motives are not necessarily mutually exclusive. For example, being inspired and motivated by a radical Islamist ideology is not necessarily mutually exclusive from some sort of mental health issues. We saw that in the Fort Hood massacre by an American soldier that was radicalized and influenced by Al-Qaeda operative Anwar al-Awlaki, who was subsequently killed by a drone in Yemen. And we saw that in the case in San Bernardino as well. So those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and local radicalization is the key here. You know, individuals that are looking for a cause, individuals that are looking for some sort of greater value, easily latch on to radical Islamist ideology. We saw that in the case in the Brussels and the Paris attacks, actually, where individuals were these terrorists were either were having financial problems or they were having mental issues. They were quickly radicalized, but whether it was through online radicalization or through an ISIS operative. Same thing in Orlando. You can easily regard whether or not radical Islamist ideology was the primary cause, and it is absolutely, without question, a major driving factor here. But let's not forget that this radicalization is homegrown. It is local, and it is easily and quickly done through the internet, through online forums, and when you
so if it's quickly done, that makes it hard to catch.
absolutely. It makes it hard to catch, but they were absolutely on. But this terrorist in Orlando, and I'm not going to say his name, was on the FBI's watch list. He was investigated before. They knew that something wrong was happening. His colleagues in the security company that he's working with raised red flags. In fact, many of his former colleagues who were interviewed subsequently said, we were not surprised that this terror attack happened. So without question, in my view, it was preventable.
All right, and he also had that right to carry and conceal weapons, but that's a different debate. Lots of reactions coming in. This one on the hashtag F24 debate, easily avoidable because all the actors in terror activity in France and the US are not newbies and are known to the authorities very, very well. Let's go into a little bit what happened overnight just outside of Paris with that orphaned 3-year-old, his parents stabbed to death by a 25-year-old man who had lived in the area, the siege happening at their homes. The representative of one of the main police unions believes the victims were staked out, and that, he says, marks a precedent.
This is the first time that a policeman, his wife, and his kid have been targeted the way they were yesterday. It's the first time that they're targeted outside of work. And this indicates a degree of radicalization that exceeds what we had feared until now. And also a level of professionalism. They're really investigating. They're able to identify our colleagues and track them down all the way to their homes. And that's just, there are no words for this.
All right, let me get your reaction, Ricardo Beretsky. Is it a precedent? Was there a stakeout?
Well, first of all, I think this is very well organized, and it's a real danger of police officers, security officers, intelligence officers being exposed in the process through lists accumulated. What we should ask here is, where did this list come from? Because the way it works in intelligence services, whether it is the opposition or whether it's a terrorist group or whether it's a government, there's a fundamental basis. And one of the key factors is how do they verify this information to be correct when they accumulate the list? So there is an alarming question that we have to look at. Is it possible that ISIL has actually infiltrated any of the security forces? And that's a real serious question that has to be answered. Because if they don't pay attention to this particular question, the things could get much worse. Our estimation is that ISIL is, and we said it from ESEPs, particularly in our reports in the past, that they are testing the ground. They're testing the ground, the barriers. We have seen this happening. They've done exactly the same.
But hang on a second, Ricardo, what evidence would you have of ISIS infiltrating the police?
Let us say this, right? There must be a way they verify the information. There must be a way they verify the information to have the correct address or correct information, particularly now that we know there was a list found. But most important is, how do they do this? Well, we believe that cyber industry plays a huge role in this. Why? Because you have a lot of tools at the moment that can be used freely available to anybody, military-grade tools for communication. And this is one of the big problems. If these tools are used by the internet or the phone or the iPhone or whatever phone they use, they can communicate this information. And the second point is how do they verify? It's impossible to verify this information unless they have access to resources. And the question is, who is these resources?
But it is possible that he personally knew the police officer. After all, the police officer was serving in his town.
Yeah, but we have to understand here, how does intelligence work? Intelligence is gathered in knowing the subject. So the subject can be under observation for many years. As naturally in that process, in most cases, when the subject is engaged or targeted, they would actually know that target very well. So this is a difference between investigation and intelligence. And what is really important here is that ISIL has taken this intelligence capability outside of the reach of the ordinary. And another thing that we have to pay real attention to is that it's now coming very evident that a lot of the recruitments in the cyber is actually underage. And this is information not really mentioned anywhere. But this is real danger.
Ricardo, we're going to pick up on those points because we're running short on time. And I'll also get the reaction of Asiam El Difraoui, who joins us now, who will be joining us for part 2 of our discussion. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.